Hello, everybody. Welcome to the National Parents Union Policy Week panel, legislative panel. So happy to have you join us. I am Marisol Quevedo Reducha, the Chief of Strategy and Partnerships for the National Parents Union. Before we get started, I want to share our instructions for interpretation. So for those who will need interpretation in Spanish, I'm going to go ahead and give the instructions in Spanish first. La función de interpretación se activará al comienzo de este seminario. Verán un botón de interpretación con un icono de globo en su menú en la parte inferior de la ventana de Zoom. Los participantes conectados por un teléfono, tableta, como un iPhone o un iPad, deberán seleccionar el botón más en el menú Zoom para encontrar el botón interpretación. Tendrá la opción de dejar la interpretación desactivada o de seleccionar uno de los canales de interpretación inglés o español. Y una nota importante, si selecciona uno de los canales, asegúrese de hablar solo en el idioma de ese canal. So really quick for our instructions for simultaneous interpretation, the interpretation feature is activated now at the start of the seminar, and there's a globe icon on the bottom of the menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. For those who are connected by smartphone, tablet, such as an iPhone or an iPad, will need to select the More button in your Zoom menu in order to find the interpretation button. Leave interpretation off or select one of the interpretation channels, so English or Spanish. And then if you select one of the channels, please be sure to speak or to type only in that language of that channel. So with that, we are going to show you our Mpu Introductional video. And we'll just wait while it gets started.
Could actually be parents and families, instead of simply fighting for survival without a safe and affordable place to live, and not knowing if there'd be enough grocery money to last until payday, and stopping the endless cycle of generational institutional racism and a blind allegiance to an education system that maintains an addiction to a status quo that pushed out, underserved, and failed us as children ourselves, and expects us to sacrifice our own babies to protect their system because those who have always done it this way are too comfortable. Mothers, fathers, tias, abuelas, grandpas, grandmas, nanas, and papas, fighting for our seat at the table. The National Parents Union was born out of a desire to connect together to ensure that no parent or family will ever have to stand alone again, that no group of parents will ever have to go up against the most powerful political special interest groups in the nation without other groups having their back. That together, we could stand united as the critical missing piece that's keeping America from its true promise of delivering on the dream of a bright future for every single child. And that no one will ever speak for us, for our communities, our families, or our children, but instead, we would speak for ourselves. Our kids, our voice, the National Parents Union.
That video, it gets me every time. We are the National Parents Union, and we are a network of highly effective parent organizations and grassroots activists across the country. And we are united behind a common set of goals and principles to channel the power of parents. Our family advocates, our delegates, work tirelessly to improve the quality of life for children across the United States and define the educational conversation. The National Parents Union hosts monthly polls, national polls, so that we can really see what the thoughts are of parents and what parents are wanting for their children. I'd like to introduce Lynn Turnbull, who is a seasoned strategist with proven results in developing advocacy and communication initiatives for social change. As an advisor to the National Parents Union, she leads the national polling efforts to ensure parent priorities are incorporated into the national narrative and policy and decision-making in public education. Perry is going to be reviewing our May polling data with you, and she'll be joining us during our panel conversation. Perry, please share our polling data.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here both as a mom, a stepmom, a foster mom, and just an advocate for parents. So what's really important about our polling, and in a minute, I'm going to ask my colleague Shay to move my slides along as we go through this quite quickly. But two things I really wanted to make sure you understand about the polling that we conduct at the National Parents Union. When the pandemic first hit last spring and schools were closing, National Parents Union recognized that we would need to understand how parents were feeling, what their concerns were, what their ideas are, and their priorities for their children's education. And so we began polling back in April, and we're one of the only organizations that's been polling throughout this entire time. As a result, we have a very good idea of what parents have been thinking and the trends. And what's really amazing is I work in a lot of polling issues and across the country in different places. The results have been extremely consistent. Our parents know exactly what they think their children need, and policymakers and education leaders should really be paying attention. The second thing is this is the only poll in the nation that actually has parents deciding the questions, identifying the issues. So we are often ahead of the curve in terms of what's coming down the pike in terms of the issues that parents really want to see addressed. So from parents for parents. Let's go ahead, Shay, and move along in our slides, and we'll pass this one. This just shows you how long we've been polling. And if we can just go to the first, keep going to at least 2 more slides. I want to talk a little bit about the issues that we like to learn about. So if you go to the next slide, today the conversation is really about a high quality, families and children have access to a high quality public education as a civil right. And here is one of the first ways we know that parents are really in support of this. We know that there are many systemic racism issues and policies within our school system. And here is one of the first ones that we really want to make sure is tackled. That is, do parents across the country support banning hair discrimination, in particular for African-American students, but really for all students? And what you see here is an unbelievable result. 81% of all parents say that we should absolutely have a law that prevents this kind of discrimination. And you see it spread across all race and ethnicities. Black parents having a higher level of support, which is completely understandable given that it's often their children who are targeted. And Shay, if you go to the next slide, we'll see that this is also across all kinds of party ideology. So in other words, this is one of those issues that parents of all demographics all across the country support, ensuring that children are not discriminated against because of their hairstyle. Now, if you can keep moving across the next slides, I do want to share a little bit about the American Rescue Plan. So we wanted to know, with all of this money that is coming through the American Rescue Plan from Congress and the president to our schools, have schools shared with parents that they're getting this money, how they plan to use this money? Are they seeking input from parents? And here's our first indication that they are not. So we asked, has your child's school communicated with you about the funding coming to them? And only 28% said yes. In fact, a majority of parents said no. And you can see across the country in the different regions, we see very little information trickling down to parents. And if you go to the next slide, what's even more surprising perhaps is that schools are not asking parents at all what they think the school should be doing with these funds to help their children. Only 22% of parents say that their school has actively asked them to provide some input or feedback on how the funds should be spent. This is really a disgrace. We must ensure that schools are engaging parents to ensure that these funds are used in the best way possible for each child to ensure their success. And if we go to the next slide, what's even more unfortunate, depressing, inappropriate, if you will, is that we see families with lower levels of income, those are the bars on the top, are even less likely to have been provided information from their school or to have been asked to engage. Families with higher levels of income are more likely that their schools will have engaged them. This just cannot stand. Families should be participating in these kinds of conversations at their school, regardless of their income. And the last slide on this, Shay, if you'll just move forward, please. This is a little hard to read quickly, but basically we ask parents, how would you like to see these funds spent? And you see overwhelming support for quite a few things. 82% say it's very important or a top priority to ensure all children have access to high-speed internet and devices like computers and laptops. They want to ensure children with disabilities have the services and support. They want free breakfast and lunch program. And then mental health is really critical. It's one of those issues that we have seen consistently parents are concerned about. So providing those kinds of services. So my point on this slide to share is less about all of these points here and the percentage of parents agreeing, but to say parents have a very good idea of what their children need right now, and schools should be engaging them to have these conversations. Next slide, please. All right, you can go to the next slide. So here is the question of today's panel. Do parents believe that access to a high quality public education should be a civil right? We've been testing this since last spring. The green bar on the top shows the percentage of parents saying yes. It is unbelievable. It is very unusual to see an issue have this kind of support and such so low levels, if you will, of opposition. So 81% of parents say that absolutely access to high quality public education should be a civil right. Next slide, please. The other thing that parents have told us consistently is they just don't want schools to reopen in the way that they were. We know that many children their needs were not being met. And so you see in this orange bar on the top, we ask, should schools rethink how they're educating children? Majority of parents throughout the pandemic have said yes. And a much smaller percentage of parents, which is the blue line, suggest that we should just go back to the way things are. So very important moment in time. We have funding coming from Congress and the federal government to reimagine schools. Parents are saying they want schools reimagined and they want access to public education to be a civil right. Next slide, please. And, this is really one of those slides that just makes me very concerned about our children. So as a parent, I know my children learn less this year. We have been asking since last spring, do parents think their children are learning less, more, or about the same? And the red bar at the top shows just how high a percentage of parents think their children are learning less. Almost half of our parents, so 43%, say their children have just learned less this year. So there's a lot of unfinished learning that has to be made up over the summer and into the fall. And educators really should be paying attention to what parents think their children need to do that. Next slide, please. All right, my last set of slides are around what do parents want to see for next year. We were very interested in knowing, do parents want their children back in person full-time at school next year? Did they want a full-time online remote option at home, or both? And what you see here, the purple line at the top on these graphs, on the left-hand side, the question is about this school year. So the school year that's just being completed, and then the next school year. This is really interesting. A majority of parents, 56% of parents, think both options should be completely offered by all schools, and parents should be able to choose the option that they think is best for their child. In other words, parents are not saying that schools should all be back in person in the fall or all online. They really want to ensure that parents have the ability to choose which option is best for each of their children. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share a couple of breakdowns about how this data plays out. So if you look at this chart here, we're asking, do you want your child to attend school in person? That's the blue bars. So 51% of parents across the country say they do want full in-person at school. But let's not forget the other 41% here. Those two green bars to the right, 20% of parents say they only want an online remote option for their child, and another 21% say they want some combination. And you can see how this mirrors across the country in every place. It is not 100% of parents wanting in person. So my point with this slide and the next couple of slides, and you can go to the next one, please, is to say that we really need to be thinking through what options we're offering families. They definitely want to be able to make the choice. And here, I just wanted to break it down by party ideology. So Republicans are more likely to want their children in person than, say, independents and Democrats, but you still see a fairly high percentage of Republicans saying they want to be able to have a choice for their child. Next slide, please. And here again, and this is one of the things that's being reported right now across the country in many media outlets, the difference between white parents and parents of color. So white parents are more likely to say they want their children in person next year, where we see parents of color, communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and have lots of other issues around trust with school systems, trust with healthcare, not having access all of the things that I talked about at the very beginning around systemic racism, we see parents of color saying, look, we need to have these options available so that we can do what's best for our child and our family. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, and I just wanted to share this to really put a fine point on the issue of whether or not parents want to change schools if they are not offered what they're asking. So we ask parents, if your school does not offer you the option you want for your child, whether that's in person or an at-home remote option, will you change schools next year? 3 in 10 parents say they will, regardless of the option. So a large percentage of parents are saying, I want my child to go in person, but if they don't offer that, I'm moving schools. Another significant portion of parents are saying, I want a remote at home option for my child. If they don't offer that, I will change schools. This really just makes the point again that parents are saying they should be provided options. Schools need to educate children where they are, and we need to find the best option for each child to meet their individual needs. Those are the end of my slides. I'm going to transition back to the team, but I just wanted to say all of these results are available on our website at nationalparentsunion.org. And we have them from, like I said, last spring through now, and we will continue to update it and post results there. So thank you. Back to you, Marisol.
Thank you so much, Perry Lynn. It's so important. You know, every time when I look at our data, I get this like feelings, and that they're not necessarily good feelings. They're feelings that I'm like, I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel frustrated that the system is not listening to parents. And then I also find myself getting into a space of almost apathy, like giving up, because there's been such a, like so many decades of inaction on the system's part for the betterment of our children. And what I love about this work, and what I'm really excited about with this panel today, is that we are in action. We are no longer standing by the sidelines. And the National Parents Union has created a space for all parents to figure out how to push their way into the system and say, this is no longer okay. I'm no longer going to trust that you're doing right by my child. I'm no longer going to question or not question what it is that the choices that are being made. So thank you so much for the polls. And I hope that you can stay on, Perry Lynn, and if there's any support from the polls that you feel that you can give our panelists, please do so. So let me go ahead. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists, and then I'm going to give them each time to talk about their particular issue. And our first panelist is Ben Austin. Ben Austin has been doing this work for decades and has started a number of organizations focused on parent power. And those organizations include Parent Revolution, Students Matter, and he has now started, he is a founding partner of Education Civil Rights Now, with the mission of establishing a constitutional right to a high quality public education for children in multiple states. He also ran Kids Coalition, and he was the leader of the Parent Trigger Law in California. Ben Austin is an ally and a dear friend to the National Parents Union, and actually has sat with us, the policy committee, to really look at the legislation and build the legislation to make a high quality public education a civil right. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Marisol. It's a true honor to be here with all of you.
And what I'm hoping, Ben, is that if you could please talk about, in the big scope, what this work is, like why, so if you could go to a little bit of the origins, because you have been doing this work to get parent voice, parent option, parents at the table for decades. So if you could talk about the origin story of that and how that also has culminated now into the fight for a high quality public education as a civil right.
Yeah, Marisol, thank you again for inviting me to participate. It's a real honor. And it's been an honor to go on this journey with NPU and to craft, I think you referenced earlier, the NPU Education Civil Rights Framework, which I would imagine we'll get into. One other thing I wanted to say about the poll and your feelings about the poll. I loved, Marisol, how you kind of talked about how you felt about a poll, because usually those kind of conversations get really nerdy really fast. And the way I felt about the poll was I felt hopeful. because as much carnage for our kids there has been during this period of time, parents are awake to the fact that education is not a civil right and that we do need to reimagine public education for our kids, especially low-income children and children of color. And so that gave me hope. The origin story for this, from a legal perspective, and Marisol, we could talk about the kind of organizing perspective as well, but from a legal perspective really does start with Brown versus Board of Education, where the US Supreme Court unanimously ruled in probably its most famous decision ever that children of color have a equitable right to an education as good as the education that my public school daughters receive. About 15 years later, in a decision called Rodriguez versus San Antonio, the Supreme Court said, oh, whoops, never mind. We were just kidding on that whole Brown v. Board thing. We had our fingers crossed behind our backs. And Thurgood Marshall, who was on the court at the time, and was the attorney for the NAACP in Brown v. Board, wrote a scathing dissent that's really worth reading, where he predicted everything that essentially has happened over the last 50 years, which is that kids would be on the outside looking in when it comes to education that affects their interests because they can't vote and they don't have power. After that ruling in a number of states, including California, there were state-based rulings about state constitutional rights. And in California and many other states, in California, there's a ruling called Serrano v. Priest, which was followed by a number of other cases where they essentially ruled that children do have a right to an education, not a quality education or a high quality education, but a right to an education. And that includes the way it's been interpreted, inputs, that if you put an equitable amount of funding into the system, an equitable amount of school hours, and to a certain extent resources, to be honest, if just like a total piece of shit comes out the other end, it's still totally constitutional under this framework. It's all about inputs, not about outputs like equity and quality. So in 2013, parents, I worked with some parents to file a lawsuit in California called Vergara versus the state of California. And that was about accepting the premise that all of these inputs are for sure necessary. They're just not sufficient, and that we need to measure outputs like equity and quality. And we won at the lower court, which in essence created through impact litigation a constitutional right to educational quality for all children of color and low income children, who there are two protected classes in that litigation in California. The teachers unions appealed that ruling up to the California Supreme Court and got it overturned. And in that ruling, the court essentially said, look, you proved your case that the protected classes, low-income children, children of color, are getting totally screwed over by the system. You just didn't prove that the Constitution protects them from getting screwed over, so you lose. And since then, I've been working with advocates like you, Marisol, and Christina and many others with NPU, constitutional scholars, organizers, and policy experts to see if we could rewrite the Constitution, not just to lead to a different outcome in Vergara, which was around teacher employment laws that elevate seniority above quality in the management of teachers, but in all education policy making, because fundamentally, I think that we're all kind of going to Vegas trying to win against the house as we try to get a system to serve kids that's not incentivized to do so. And you know, for me, parent power isn't magical because parents have all the answers. Worth noting that the status quo people don't have all the answers either. But parents just have different incentive structures than everybody else. And I think the only fundamental way to unrig the system, I love the video that talks about parents having a seat at the table, is to empower parents with a real seat at the table. Just like the other powerful people, to advocate for the interests of our kids. And the NPU Education Civil Rights Framework establishes a constitutional right to a high quality public education and empowers parents with a seat at the table to enforce that right. And I think that's the only fundamental way to unrig the system for kids and parents.
You know, what I do know as a former school leader and somebody who really loved working with people and working with a team towards a common goal for the betterment of our kids is that, you know, you said parents don't have all the answers, but what I do know is that the magic happens when everybody is included. when everybody has a voice and everybody has ownership over the actions that are happening in the system that the adults are taking for our kids. And I think that's part of the missing link. And I have a question for you. Why isn't a high quality public education a civil right already? And why would somebody fight that?
Right. It's a great question, Marisol, because in theory, the purpose of public education is to serve students. You know, one of the reasons I was hopeful about the polling, Perry Lynn's polling data, was that, you know, it's been, I don't know, think for people like you and I and a lot of the people on this panel, this has been sort of blatantly obvious for quite some time. Like, why the hell isn't this? Why isn't education a civil right? Especially because politicians, in particular Democratic politicians, I say that as somebody who worked in the Clinton White House, Democratic politicians talk about education as a civil right and have been doing so for generations, but they do it kind of as a metaphor, as a soundbite, but not as an actual civil right. And you know, what's I think one of the things that was also interesting about that polling data was the kind of super majority support across traditional lines of difference. And I mean, I am a interest, you know, I mean, my daughter, I'm a very privileged public school parent, but I've also been on the outside looking in with the parents in my school community, where both of my daughters graduated last week from schools that they haven't been at full time literally for 18 months. And it's because parents across race, class, geography, ethnicity are all recognizing they have way more in common with each other than they do with the defenders of the status quo, because we've all been on the outside looking in when, as grown-ups, are making decisions about the future of our children. And so, you know, when you ask why isn't it already a civil right, I think it hasn't already been a civil right because the status quo definitely serves the interests of powerful people, and there's a lot of people with a vested interest in keeping things the way they are, and that's why I think the militancy of NPU is what is required for this moment, to demand a seat, not ask for one. And I think this moment creates an opportunity for us to do that, because parents across all these traditional lines of difference are recognizing that we got to march together.
Thank you, Ben. And you know, I think it's the conversation is also prompted for me that the system is so resistant, right? And like you said, because it's serving somebody and serving something. And I'm going to invite Christina Laster, our Director of Policy and Legislation, to come on. Christina is a civil rights advocate. She's a humanitarian, and she's been involved in education and parent advocacy for years. She has degrees in political science and business administration. And Christina is the legal mind genius and power behind all of our advocacy work at the National Parents Union. Christina, I am hoping that you can talk about not just the work that we have going on and the work that you have done and led here at the National Parents Union, but also if you can start to address like your call, your heart's call to doing this work with and for our families.
Hi, everybody. I'm just glad to be here. You know, really, when I think about what is happening in the condition of our children and their education and their future, it compels me to do something about it. It compels me to look beyond just my household and what's happening with my children and knowing that my children are receiving a quality education, but really thinking about my community, really thinking about our national community, and then our just our global community and what's taking place. And I saw some very startling information. I'm sorry, I have something going off in the background here, but I saw some really startling information that just really moved me yesterday, as a matter of fact. And the United Nations had came out with the information saying that 6 in 10 children are not on grade level or proficient in math and English. And I thought about that. What does the future look like, right? If we have a society that is illiterate and can't calculate. And then the opportunities that I had with education, they should be growing and progressing. allowing for more children and more people to have those opportunities. But what I see is that it's really getting bad really quick. And so that's what compels me to do the work here. We have created a legislative advocacy toolkit for all of you parents and community leaders that are like-minded and would also like to begin to advocate legislatively for changes that are absolutely necessary to take place, right? We have to move beyond the common battlegrounds and enter into various battlegrounds to have our parent voices heard, and be a part of the decision making processes, whether the people that are there are uncomfortable with that or not. So that is one of the things that is going to be highly vital as we move throughout this week and throughout this year and just into the future, that we begin to normalize legislative advocacy.
And I want to jump really quick. You said something so critical. We have to do this work regardless of the other person's comfort. And we have to get comfortable with them being uncomfortable. Yes. And so I know you're going to head in, but you have done some amazing work, I think, with this, like pushing that comfort level, like standing in our comfort for our kids, so that, and provoking others. Can you talk about some of the work that you've done?
Right. And so recently, I was supporting the San Diego Unified School District parents with their battle to really have their voices come to the forefront about what took place with them in San Diego Unified School District, and why Cindy Martin was not a good candidate to be deputy ed sec, right? And so we did push to as far as we could. And, I said, even if we don't win this, we're going to go all the way until we can't do it anymore. And we're going to continue to push on the local level to make sure that people understand that children in San Diego Unified had disparate outcomes for years, that there weren't any accountability over them. And that things need to change immediately. So that was one of the things that, recently we did. Also, with regards to Justice for Journey, right? We talked about the Crown Act at the beginning of this poll and why that is vital for us to understand why that needs to be supported. And Justice for Journey is a good picture of what took place, but we know that these things take place all across the nation where our children are ostracized, are bullied, are teased, are mistreated because of what naturally grows from their body, right? Hair should be something that is acceptable. It naturally grows out of all of our bodies. And children should not be teased or harmed in their educational environments because of their hair. So we are pushing, really accountability in the Crown Act. That's one of the things we did. And, we are also, working to this co-creative story around the civil right to education as a policy effort, and other things that are vital to parents, that we push beyond our norms and push other people beyond their comfort levels, and make them hear us in various ways. We've also entered into the realm of judicial review. So on the Eighth Circuit Appellate Court level, we've entered amicus briefs, which indicate the needs of parents to be able to choose a quality education for their children, right? And so those are some of the things that we've done, and we invite you as parents and community leaders to join and do as well.
So Christina, before we move on to Kulia, who is our Midwest regional organizer, can you please share for parents that are interested in and wanting to engage in this work? They want access to that toolkit. They want to see our framework around making a high quality public education a civil right. They want to know what that, that amicus brief strategy is. Where can they go?
So if you go to nationalparentsunion.org, you will find that we have a lot of information for your use and your support and your efforts. And if you go to the legislative corner, you will be able to find that information. We have kits, parent kits, polling information, all kinds of information. And also, if you are on Facebook and you subscribe to our page, you will be able to see video trainings that you can also share, right? There is something that comes out every week that is sure to be useful to you and your community to help you in your efforts.
Thank you so much, Christina. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kulia, who is our Midwest Regional Organizer. Kulia has a Bachelor's of Science in Human Services with a minor in Human Service Administration, and she has a Bachelor's in Science in Social Studies with a graduate certificate in Secondary Urban Education with licensure, so a fellow educator. Kulia is the boots on the ground in Minnesota, educating parents on their rights and amplifying their voices every day to push for the best for our children. And Kulia, you have been involved in some amazing work in Minnesota. Minnesota is, is pushing this high quality public education as a civil right. And I know that you have both. If you could explain what you have going on with the Page Amendment, and then also the litigation regarding dyslexia. So Kulia, I'm going to turn it over to you. And you're on mute, my friend.
My name is Kulia Pringle. I am the Midwest Regional Organizer for National Parent Union. And as Marisol said, I have been on the groundwork trying to make sure that education as a civil right in Minnesota happens. For the last year and a half, Justice Page, along with Federal Reserve President Neil Kashkari, came up with the idea to change the Constitution of Minnesota to give students the civil right to a high quality education. And our current Constitution says that students are only allowed or afforded an adequate and a uniform system. And here in Minnesota, 4 out of Black children can't read at grade level. That's unacceptable. Adequate and uniform does not work. So the language for the Page Amendment is that it is upon the system to guarantee and make sure that every child has access to a high quality education. And over the last year, I've been boots on the ground, educating families on what that means, what that looks like for their family, and really just putting it in their minds that this really could happen and that their child and them have a right to push and make sure that the system works for them, making sure that every services that their child needs in order to thrive and prosper is given to them. So as I said, for the last year and a half, I've been boots on the ground. I've educated parents, I've educated nonprofits, policymakers, just giving everybody just, the idea that this is a possibility, because I don't think that people actually really just even really thought about education being a civil right. We've all just taken the system, send our kids to school every morning and just sort of, honed in on this is mandated by law and whatever happens, happens. And then those of us who can afford resources when our child isn't excelling, we get those interventions. But those of us who can't afford those resources, our children suffer either through the school to prison pipeline, or our kids are overly recommended in special education, or they're identified as having dyslexia, which leads me to our next work. As Christina talked about, we've entered the world into the legal ways of trying to make sure that parents have a right to a high quality education. I'm not sure why I froze. I hope I'm still there.
We can hear you. We can absolutely hear you.
Okay, so my camera just gave out. So there's a case here in Minnesota with called MLK, where a well-to-do white woman has a child in one of the best school districts in the state of Minnesota, Minnetonka School District. And her child first was not diagnosed with dyslexia. And then once the diagnosis happened, the school failed to provide dyslexia services. So when she sued the district, she won. The district appealed, she won that appeal, and now she is back in courts again. We have taken a position that we know that 4 out of 5 Black children cannot read in Minnesota. If one of the wealthiest women and her child is suffering in one of the richest school districts in the state, and her child isn't getting the services that they need, we know that many other children aren't getting the services that they need. And we know that by the data. So we are putting parent voices into this legal argument with MOK. And those are just a couple of the things that I'm working on when it comes to making sure that families have a right to a high quality education. Today, I will be protesting at Minneapolis Public Schools because they have not come up with the literacy plan. And as Christina said earlier, literacy is also a civil right. I believe it's a human right. If you don't have that basic foundation of literacy, you can't live a productive life. And so that's just a few things that I'm working on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kulia. I want to take advantage of having all of the panel together. So if you could all come back on, put your cameras on, and I'm going to share some more information at the end, but I want to take advantage of this moment because what I really am hoping that we can share. So the purpose of this, of our legislative week of action, it was a multifold purpose. One, to put our stake in the ground as the National Parents Union and say, a high quality public education is something that all of our children deserve, and we're here to fight for it. And also to provide an opportunity for us to share all of these tools and resources that we've provided for parents so that they can take those tools and resources and go to the decision makers. So go to your schools, go to your school board, meet with your elected officials to talk about what it is that you want for your kids. So a question that I have for all on the panel. So what we can do, whoever wants to go first, and then you can call on the next person. But what I really want to know, this is going to be a twofold question. One is, what should parents realistically expect? What should they realistically be expecting in this time of transformation? So we saw from the polls this desire for flexibility, this desire for family options, this desire for a high quality education, right? We saw there's these desires. What should parents be expected, or what should parents expect going in and talking to schools, school boards, elected officials regarding what it is that they want for their children? And aside from that, like, what should they expect coming back at them? How also can they start to build their community in the fights that they're identifying for themselves? So who would like to go first? Christina, so I'm going to have you go, and then you pass it to whomever you would like to hear from next.
So I want to be really clear and really honest. We're all in this for various reasons, but most of us, because when we did begin our advocacy, we got fought back, right? And so expect to get fought back. And don't expect that the first time that you go into a board meeting or have a meeting with your district superintendent or even a legislator that you're going to be heard the first time. I want you to have realistic expectations around that. And that's why we're joined in this collective parent power efforts to really show up in ways that we know that people will realize that we're unrelenting and consistent and we're not going away. So that's another thing. You need to be have that escalation process, right? Like, if I go into the meeting and my voice isn't heard, then what next? What am I going to do next, right? Am I going to come back with another group of parents or some community leaders and really just make sure that everything that I'm vocalizing is on the record? And then what is my next step? You have to have that before you go into a meeting and expect that the first time is not going to be the only time. I do want to be very clear that the ESSER funding that has come out is intended to go to Title I students, okay? That's the most disadvantaged and highest need students. And so that information should be given to you transparently. It shouldn't be hidden, and you shouldn't have to go through a maze to find it. However, we know that oftentimes when we're asking for fiscal transparency and accountability, we have to go through a labyrinth or a maze or puzzles, and it shouldn't be that way. So figure out what it is that your request is, go in, ask it, make sure it is on the record, and then create an escalation process and bring people with you. And you can definitely reach out to us at National Parents Union if you have any particular questions around that.
Before you pass the palabra, before you pass the word, okay, so Title I funds. for those parents that might, okay, like what is that? So as an educator, I will tell you we have our own language. So I just want to backtrack a little bit. Title I funds are federal funds that are received. And can you explain, Christina, for what population of students predominantly?
Yeah, so we're looking at Title I funds for subgroups of students that fall in the category low socioeconomic community schools typically receive Title I funds. There are funds, and I want to just backtrack. So Title I is Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which has now been reauthorized as the Every Student Succeeds Act. So some of you have heard that word before in that terminology, Every Student Succeeds Act. Some of you may have only heard of No Child Left Behind. I found out that there are schools operating under No Child Left Behind, and they're supposed to be operating under something else, Every Student Succeeds Act. So Title I is a part of that act. And is particularly for, like I said, low socioeconomic subgroups of students. We also have various articles and sections in that act that talk about English learners. And then, really indicate what is supposed to be taking place in special ed. So you definitely, if you have any questions with regards to subpopulations of students, who is supposed to be covered, what is supposed to be paid for in that act, then, definitely you can reach out or ask them now. But the ESSER funding that came from the CARES relief, there's been 3 disbursements, right? Is intended to go to students that qualify for Title I. Many of you might know it as free and reduced lunch, right? My child qualifies for free and reduced lunch. They're also qualifying for Title I funds. And so you need to be holding decision makers and school districts accountable for where that money is going and making sure that it's going to for its intended purpose and use.
And we're talking for your individual schools, millions, for districts, billions of dollars of additional funding that is supposed to be going to those groups. Some schools, because they have such a high percentage of students that fall in those categories, when they write their plans, they say, oh, it's going to be for everybody. So as parents, you want to make sure that you're going in and fighting for for transparency. What is that money being spent on? How are parents being involved in that decision-making process? Christina, who would you like to pass the word on to?
I'm going to pass the palabra to Ben.
Thank you, Christina. I love, Christina, the way you laid out kind of a strategic roadmap for organizing to strategically escalate. And I think it's really smart. I love the way your brain works. And I think it's really smart. And, Marisol, in answer to your question in terms of what you should expect, I think you should expect what Christina said, which is pushback. You should expect to be treated like you don't matter. To be treated like you don't have power. But I think what all parents, especially in this moment, must demand is to be treated just like the powerful people, not to be put on, some fancy committee with a fancy name and only advisory power, not to wait in line for hours to talk for 90 seconds to a school board that may be texting while you're talking, but to be brought into the room where the decisions are made and empowered with the exact same kind of powerful seat at the table that the status quo people have. That's what we all collectively need to demand. And I think, Christina, kind of laddering from your organizing framework, I think one of the pivots, I think, for us to all begin to think about is that this moment, for obvious reasons, has awoken a lot of parents and a lot of voters, and that creates a big wave for us to surf. But we need to be careful about letting this window close before we have effectuated that kind of transformational change. And that, Perry Lynn's polling, I think, really brought out into stark relief that parents do not want to rebuild the status quo ante as we reopen our schools with all of its inefficiencies and institutional racism baked into that cake. They do want to reimagine public education. And, it seems like a pretty obvious way to do that, or begin doing that, is to establish a constitutionally mandated North Star that says, as we reopen our schools and bring our kids back into our classroom, let's just put kids first. Let's just do that. Let's empower parents with a seat at the table to advocate for their notion of what it means to put kids first, and to communicate as we're organizing with parents in our communities that what happened over the last 18 months is not the core problem. It's a symptom of the problem. It was a symptom of the fact that powerful special interests were issuing edicts from behind closed doors about the education of our children and the future of our children. And that's why my daughters just graduated from schools they haven't been at in 18 months. And so, even if we reopen in the fall, just because like the weight of science is so obvious and the political imperative is so powerful, that doesn't solve the core problem. The core problem is that parents don't have a seat at the table, and education is not a civil right. And that's, I think, the North Star that we need to focus on. I will pass it to Kulia, because I want to keep learning. Kulia, I want to connect with you and learn more about the work you're doing on the Page Amendment. And I also am dyslexic, and I would love to learn about that work as well.
Absolutely. I would echo everything you just said, Ben, and everything Christina said. Expect pushback, expect disappointment, expect to be treated like crap, expect to, be, not to be listened to. I always tell parents, I don't care who you take with you, make sure you go into that meeting with somebody. If it's the neighbor, make sure there's a pen and paper there. Make it look as official as possible. Anytime you do an email, CC 2 or 3 people on there. And then, as Christina said earlier, make sure there's an escalation plan. Every action that I do starts off with the meeting, but usually ends up with me in front of somewhere with the picket fence, with the picket sign, demanding something. So have an escalation plan. What's next? As Christina said, I am all over the federal funding money in Minnesota. I've had virtual town halls with Minneapolis Public Schools. National Parent Union does have a seat at that table in Minneapolis. When it comes to recommendations for ESSER 3 funding, I will be hosting a virtual town hall with the superintendent in St. Paul. And as the state is doing an awful job when it comes to community engagement and making sure that BIPOC communities have a voice at the table when it comes to ARP funding. We are escalating our action in Minnesota and involving federal officials because there has to be some accountability for this money. This money should not just be coming down. What I've noticed is that districts and our state has their priorities set already. And even though they're taking recommendations, they have their set priorities. So for me, it's just pomp and circumstance when it comes to community engagement. So please, when it comes to that money, as Christina says, it is incumbent upon us. We are the people that are going to be responsible for making sure that there's some accountability for this money. And I would just say, make sure that you are always, always, always connected. And if you're not connected, become a member and join the National Parent Union.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kulia. Perry Lynn, anything that you can add, please?
Yes, thank you. So ditto on everything that's been said, but I have a couple of additional thoughts. The first is that I wanted to make sure, I probably didn't say this at the beginning of the polling presentation, but everything that we learn from our poll, we share with national leaders. So we share it with Secretary Cardona to make sure that they are aware of what parents are saying. So leveraging the resources that MPU and some of your state and local partners have as you go into these conversations is going to be powerful. The second thing is, do not accept the status quo and do not get pulled into the arguments that they are making. So the debate over the last year has been, are schools open for in-person or for remote? Rather than, how can we educate children where they are with high quality education, right? We in some ways, unfortunately, allow the status quo leaders to define the debate of the moment. And what's really important beyond our polling, we track, other kinds of surveys and polls and work that's going on. There is no question that even in our very polarized environment, Democrats and Republicans actually both agree on this issue of reimagining. Democrats lead a little bit more from the equity angle, Republicans lead a little bit more from the accountability angle, but both of those are where we connect as parents. We want both. And so the moment definitely is now to see change. And the final thing I will say about not accepting the status quo is we have seen multiple governors and school districts say they're only opening in one way, or they're only going to do X, Y, and Z. And my first question to them is always, did you actually ask your parents? The answer is almost always no. And so pushing them to make sure that what parents actually think is important for their children will be critical. And leveraging the groups that are part of NPU is part of it. Finding other allies. There are plenty of other groups and individuals who agree with us on this issue. And being prepared with that sort of escalation to walk away, right? To make a change and move your child if you have to, if you have that option. Because I don't think real change will come until we can get the civil right as a constitutional change, litigate, and actually show that we are moving with our feet. And we are not going to accept what the status quo has said. So finally, I'll just wrap with, in addition to what Christina said about the funding that's coming, the president in his budget recommendations increased significantly. So in addition to all of the pandemic funding through the American Rescue Plan, the CARES Act, he has also said that he wants to increase Title I and funding for children with disabilities. There is so much money, to be really honest, so much money flowing to schools right now, we can anticipate that in many instances it will not be used with children in mind, right? With the students at the center and the focus. No one should be telling you as a parent that there aren't sufficient funds or resources to help your child in this moment. There is enough money to give every child in this country an individual tutor to help them be successful in whatever their needs are. So I don't want you to hear that message and to say, oh, okay, they've looked at it, it's not possible. That's just false. They are going to try to use the money in ways that further the status quo, further their power. And we need to continue to push back to say, no, we're just not going to accept that.
And I just want to jump in because what that can look like. So things to be aware of. Your kid should not be fighting about bringing a pencil to school. And also that's why you want to be really pushing into what is that money being spent on? Is it being spent on consultants, on material? Has that instructional material been approved by you? Is it extra time for a staff member? What is that extra time being spent on? And I will also tell you that we need to be on the lookout for when the timelines for monies to be spent, because if the timelines are too short, we have to be advocating to lengthen those timelines so that there is parent voice in the mix. Otherwise, money will be spent stupidly and without parent voice and without clear connections of how that money is being spent to show the impact, that it is the positive impact that it is going to have on our children's literacy and numeracy. So those are questions that you always want to ask. And you also want to ask, if you are the parent of a child who is learning English, how is that money going to be spent to help them in their biliteracy? Not just in becoming English proficient, but also in their biliteracy and in honoring the language that they come to. The National Parents Union was the dream and the idea and the hope of our founders, Carrie Rodriguez and Alma Vivian Marquez, two moms whose own educational systems, whose own educational journeys, they were failed by their own systems. And the dream of this organization was to be a place where this work can happen, the work that we've talked about. And so we invite you to continue to join us on this journey. We have everything that we've talked about this week. Our delegates and members are having meetings with elected officials. We have, in part of preparation that Kulia talked about, a beautiful leave behind that we encourage that our delegates and members leave. It does have the National Parents Union language on it, on what our initiatives are, but it's a great format and a sample for you to look at. So if you could please, if you could please put in who to contact for all of that information. Please stay connected to our website, stay connected to us. We are here for you when you get that pushback. We are here to support you. I want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Ben, Perry, Lynn, Christina, Kulia. Thank you so much. Thank you to our delegates. A special shout out to Shay Mackin from the Policy Council who helped organize our event today, to Colleen and Jada on our communications team to make this happen, and also to our founder, Carrie Rodriguez. This work would not, and our president, this work would not be possible. We would not be here without her fight. And she was not able to join us today because she had to meet with a funder who is supporting us in being able to do this work. So thank you. As always, we are here for you, and happy National Parents Union Advocacy Week. Have a beautiful day, everybody.